for questions and answers later. My name is Rachel Porter, and I am with NorCal Services for Deaf and Hard of Hearing. I'm also an advocate for DeafSafe program. And I'm very, very pleased to introduce the two ladies that we have here today. I'm going to let them introduce themselves in a moment. But the topic of today's presentation is going to be about access to the justice system and what that really means. So you guys know that the judicial system is very complex for anybody, especially for deaf survivors. Deaf survivors are very overwhelmed and find even more challenges and barriers. So today we're going to pinpoint some exact things for barriers. For example, we need an interpreter in the court system. Does that mean they have easy access and that everything is the same for deaf survivors? Is that true? Yes or no? We'll talk about that. So we're going to delve in more and see if really, to be honest, that isn't true for deaf survivors. That's not the case. So I'm going to go ahead and let Martha and Aracelia go ahead and begin. And we're not going to keep the video on me. I'm going to have just their video on, and I'm going to be busy in the chat box answering your guys' questions. So feel free to ask questions in the chat box, and I will answer them. Also, one more thing, we're going to have a poll, and just some quick poll questions we're going to ask. So the first one is, what is your guys' role in your agency? What do you guys do? There's 10 answers you can choose from in the poll, and then I'm going to pull up the questions so that you can see, and then you're going to go ahead and select the one that best fits your role. So just pick one, okay? So I'm going to leave it there for about 2 minutes and give you guys some time to answer that question, okay? So I'm going to go ahead, and I think I see somebody raise their hand. One moment. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start the poll right now. Okay, great. We have interpreter translator. Okay, we have a couple here. Okay, we have batter intervention or sex offender programs. That's another option. Lawyer, prosecutor from a deaf organization. That's great. We have a couple people from a deaf organization. About 84% or so, maybe 83, 84% for domestic violence, sexual assault organization. Okay, pretty interesting, pretty nice. Just a few more seconds here. All right, perfect. Thank you guys for your responses so far in that poll. I'm gonna go ahead and close the poll. If you did miss it, you can go ahead and put your answer in the chat box there. Or if you feel like something didn't really match you from that list, go ahead and tell us in the chat. But thank you for your responses. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and hand it over to Martha. I'll see you guys later. Okay, bye-bye for now for me. All right, hi everybody. My name is Martha Jamison, and I work at DeafSafe. That program is underneath NorCal Services for Deaf and Hard of Hearing. So we also serve deaf, hard of hearing and deaf blind consumers in the 24 northeastern counties of California.
Hello everyone, my name is Aracelia. I'm from DeafHope. I am one of 3 members. We serve the Bay Area, and we also serve out-of-state consumers. I'm really excited to be here. I also want to mention that we want to thank the Office on Violence Against Women for sponsoring this webinar. Thank you all, OVW. Appreciate you. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started with the first item on the agenda. We both work a lot in courtrooms, and so we see a lot of specific types of barriers and challenges that deaf survivors go through when they're navigating the justice system. I want you all to be mindful that ASL is not the only language in the courtroom. We have English Sign Language, we have Mexican Sign Language, we have German Sign Language. We have a wide range of languages being used in the court system, and ASL is just one of those many types of languages.
Also, hey, it looks like we did get a chat that said, would the second interpreter mind just being a little bit louder, just so we're going to let the interpreters know really quick. All right, so thank you guys. Sorry to interrupt. Okay, and also, I think you were saying there's about how many sign language systems? I think 250 or more in the world.
English has their own word order, and ASL has a different grammatical structure entirely. Their word order is different than English, and so, for example, me go to the store is a different grammatical structure than English. And so English, you would have the car swerved and hit the tree. You have a lot of those grammatical functions. In ASL, it's more visual. You have the tree, and then you show the car hitting the tree. So it's a very visual language. And so when deaf survivors are giving their testimony, that 3D information is translated into a concrete English word order. And that's really challenging when you're thinking about a traumatic incident. So when an interpreter is brought into a courtroom, people often think that one interpreter fits many different types of deaf consumers. That's not true. I personally sign more of an ASL word order, where Martha here signs in a different word order and more of English style. So each deaf person out there has their own language preferences. One big thing I think that we need to understand is why ASL interpreters are not able to match every single consumer. Think about foreign language interpreters. They are able to really assimilate the whole entirety of the language, and they're able to code switch and find the right tone, the right word to match their consumers. Now, interpreters that are not native language users, they have to go through an academic process. They learn more of a specific style of ASL that's a little bit more rigid. So their ability to interact with deaf folks that have a large range of signing styles, perhaps grassroots signs, different things like that, that is sometimes hard to understand if you come from an academic background.
All right, so we're going to show a little bit of that difference between our signing styles. She signs a little bit more ASL order, and I'm a little bit more English. So we're going to have two different sentences and show the difference, or two interpreters. So we're going to show the differences. So first thing, we're going to talk about the issues that we face for survivors in the courtroom. And then, you know, there's some obvious issues that come up repeatedly. The first thing is that sometimes the interpreter is not the best fit. The ADA does require that the interpreter must be certified. If they're not certified, it doesn't mean that they're a great fit in the legal court system, because by ADA law, they have to be a qualified interpreter. So one interpreter does not fit all. Maybe one interpreter is really great interpreting for a church. Maybe another interpreter is great in the hospital or medical field. But there's different ways an interpreter can go in their field, and not one interpreter is best fit for all. And many times that can be a challenge, because there's only, I think, approximately 4 legally certified courtroom interpreters in Northern California. So that means that the court is desperate to find legally certified sign language interpreters, and they might just, you know, have to go with a generally, you know, certified interpreter who's not legally certified. So their word choice may not be the same as a legally certified interpreter, and sometimes the court just takes what it can get, and they just take the interpreter's word for it. However, sometimes that can make or break a case, and you have to keep that in mind. Also, in the same idea, with domestic violence and sexual assault, there is very limited funding available. There are not very many resources. When it comes to domestic violence and sexual assault agencies, when it comes to deaf or deaf-blind survivors, those agencies are very rare. You know, we ourselves serve 24 northeastern counties. We're the only agency that serves deaf or hard of hearing people. Those clients who go into the legal system and don't know the process, don't know what to expect. And so they're just taking what the interpreter says. Like when the interpreter says, hey, you're being served, the deaf person thinks, I'm being served. So they're interrupting you going, what? I don't get it. What do you mean? Would you mind explaining and breaking that down? And the interpreter feels like, I don't know. I can't really have a double role as their advocate and an interpreter. So the interpreter can't be an advocate. That's not the interpreter role. So they have to have a deaf advocate with them. Another thing is that in the deaf community, we all really know each other. It's a tight-knit community. We have a very tight and close bond, which is good, but could also be bad because a lot of deaf people know a lot of other deaf people. We also know a lot of interpreters. We get a lot of the same interpreters. So for us, let's say we're going in for a pap smear. We're going to a church event. It might be the same interpreter because there aren't a lot of interpreters out there. So for a quick example, if I'm going into the courtroom and I'm a survivor and I want to get a restraining order against my husband because we're in the midst of a divorce, he's being abusive, and then the court interpreter, surprise, surprise, is the same interpreter that interprets at my church. Now I feel embarrassed as the deaf survivor. I might feel ashamed or want to hide. I don't want the church to know what's going on. It might seem a little bit taboo. So that's an example of how close we are and how tight-knit things can be.
I also want to explain a little bit more on the topic of in the eyes of a domestic violence and sexual assault survivor, particularly in the courtroom and what they experience and how a deaf advocate goes through that with them during their court experience. Many of our survivors are victims of language deprivation, and it's a severe issue. Some survivors are from other countries. I did have one survivor that I worked with that came to us and needed help, but they were from the country of Afghanistan. They had come here when they were 14 years old. They had no language. They just had minimum gestures, and they had home signs that they had developed with their family. So we worked together. We taught this person sign language. And since this person had such serious language deprivation, that person had no language foundation that was formed at a younger age. So that means that her ability to acquire language was hindered. And so it might be that way for the rest of her life. Many survivors talk about their experience. I'm deaf, Martha's deaf, but still, as deaf people, it's hard to get that full story from a consumer. They might use name signs that they don't know the spelling to the full name. They may not be able to explain and articulate a relationship with a person. And so that sometimes takes us 5 to 15 meetings to really get the full story of what happened to that survivor and what it is that they're trying to share with us. So if you can imagine a certified deaf interpreter was brought into that interaction, perhaps they could find all of that information out in one meeting and maybe not. So you just have to think about that when you're having an interview with domestic violence and sexual assault survivors. One thing that's really interesting, ASL does not look the same. There are different factions in the deaf community that have their own signs. There is a fluid use of language and people play with language. So one deaf community member may use one type of sign language style and another deaf community member may use a different signing style. So for example, Black ASL has their own dialect. So if a survivor went to a sexual assault courtroom and they were signing this, the interpreter may be a white interpreter and they might translate it as saying, this person is saying they're stuck. But in Black ASL, the actual meaning of that sign is that I'm pregnant. Now for a Black ASL, there's a lot of historical context that goes back to days of slavery. So slave owners would often rape their slaves and those survivors had to accept that. And so they changed the sign from pregnant, which is what white American Sign Language users do, to stuck, which is what the sign is in Black American Sign Language. So that's one example of signs in their own particular cultural context. So ASL is very fluid, like I mentioned. So that means that my context could mean something to me, but might be interpreted to somebody else as something different. Let me give you an example of that. If I were to say to somebody, hey, I was crawling on my stomach, I was reaching across the floor trying to get to some water. So the way I sign that shows that I am on my stomach trying to get to water. But if I were to sign instead, I'm wiped out, which is the same sort of hand shape, it means that I am so exhausted, I'm laying on my back, it's just super tired. So during an interview, it's really important that those details are clarified. So if this person is signing, "I'm wiped out," different interpreters could interpret that concept differently. So the credibility gets questioned, and it's really up to the interpreter and their translation. So it's important for them to clarify whenever possible. There are also signs that could mean different things. Like this, for example, could mean a vitamin. It could mean vibrate. And this sign here too for rape, it can be interpreted at different things. Some people think it means cramps when that's not the case. So it's really essential that an interpreter and people that are interviewing a deaf survivor, they look for opportunities to bring a deaf interpreter and clarify any sort of signs, or a certified interpreter. Also, a detective, when they are having an interview with the survivor, they need to continually use open-ended questions. They don't want to lead the survivor in their retelling. So when they sign, "Were you assaulted?" the deaf survivor may interpret it instead as, "Was I being threatened?" because the sign is the same. The context is really dependent on the meaning. So there's so many signs that can mean different things. So for example, "Were you hit?" or "Were you threatened?" Those both mean very different things. And the detective needs to know the particular dynamic that happened. That's why a CDI is really important to come in and clarify, to give examples. Were you hit? Were you slapped? Were you spit on? Then that survivor can really hone in on what it is that they're trying to say.
Also, I did want to add something that many deaf people don't understand what abuse is. So they make sign what looks like the sign for abuse, and they're like, "Oh no, I wasn't abused," because they weren't hitting me physically. Oh, but they did slap me. So a lot of times deaf people rely on the way the sign is produced, and things need to be clarified. So that concept needs to be broken down. Were you slapped? Were you taken advantage of when it came to your money, instead of just these sign for abuse? So there's a different uh, a difference between deaf culture and hearing culture. So for example, when I'm watching the interpreter, I typically will be nodding my head just as I'm watching, which shows the interpreter that I'm understanding what they're saying and to continue interpreting. But a hearing person who doesn't know, maybe a judge or a jury member might think, "Wow, she's nodding. Therefore, she's admitting that she's guilty," which is not true. That's not necessarily the case. It's just a difference in cultures. Also, a lot of times people who are not used to meeting deaf people aren't really used to some concepts where let's say a lawyer will be asking questions, but over and over, the same kind of question. And then it feels a little antagonistic. We might feel like maybe we're not understanding them. I'm thinking maybe they don't understand me. And then maybe I have to change my answer because they're clearly asking the same thing. Maybe I'm misunderstanding. And that is, a really severe issue for deaf people. They have to navigate this difference in cultures.
I also want to mention the dynamic of nuances in facial expressions and the way they're produced. Those slight differences are used by deaf people, and that is not necessarily a particular sign. It's more nuanced language. Let me give you an example. Say a husband pushed me, and I defended myself, and I'm showing that by lifting up my forearm and pushing back. Now the interpreter says to me, did your husband push you?" And then I can say, "Yeah," and I use my facial expressions to show the degree of that action. So the concept is that I was pushing back out of self-defense, but some interpreters will not pick up on those nuanced facial expressions and instead simplify the interpretation, saying that I pushed him because he pushed me, but really the concept is there was self-defense. During an interview, a detective will sometimes ask, in sexual assault cases or rape cases, "Were you two hooking up?" And the interpreter sometimes will see that question and wonder on how to interpret that. Maybe they'll lessen the severity of it because hooking up in deaf culture has a negative stigma. So an interpreter that says, "Hey, were you sleeping with that man?" That person might say, "Yeah, I did go into bed with him. I was sleeping with him," but it doesn't really have that same meaning as hooking up. And that's the intent of the detective's question.
And I know and I know we received a note here that asked, somebody left a comment saying for one of the interpreters to talk a little bit louder. So thanks to the interpreters. Okay, then over here, let's see what's next.
So I just gave different examples of situations that we see and different barriers that we face as deaf community members. And so I'm sure you all feel a little bit overwhelmed by that. And so I want to give you all some considerations on how those barriers can be lessened and perhaps done away with. I think a lot of our struggle with survivors comes from interpreters. Perhaps the survivor knows that interpreter, or they've interpreted for that deaf person in other situations. Because there's such a limited pool of interpreting services, we encourage people to change the approach. So instead of just assigning interpreters to a courtroom, ask that deaf survivor what their preference is. Do they want a male? Do they want a female? Do they prefer someone that's more of an ASL interpreter or an English interpreter? There's such a range of interpreting services out there that needs to be given to the deaf survivor to request. When we come into a courtroom, sometimes we'll ask, hey, where's the interpreter? And the secretary will say, oh, nobody requested an interpreter. And perhaps we already did. Or maybe there is an interpreter there, but then that interpreter got taken out of that case to another case that has a bigger priority. So sometimes the court also tells the deaf consumer, hey, the interpreter canceled, they had to go somewhere else, but it's important to get that heads up. Sometimes we file paperwork that isn't that effective. Sometimes the interpreter request could be done online, which would be a lot easier and directly empowers the deaf consumer to request what it is that they need. Often we see courtroom clerks saying, oh, we didn't know that there was an interpreter needed. So there's a lot of gaps between the courtroom and the sexual assault coordinator. Sometimes court interpreters will say, I was here all day. Nobody came to me and told me to go to that particular courtroom for this case.
Also, another really good way to help deaf survivors would be through deaf advocacy. And I really wish that, you know, a lot of these agencies would be more prominent, because we really don't have a lot of deaf advocacy agencies. So it's a huge challenge. Not just that, but interpreters. You know, for me, sometimes I might not have any communication. How, if I was a survivor, would I navigate the system? So it's up to me to continually ask for an interpreter over and over. And so the survivor is already stressed. They're already overwhelmed. And on top of that weight, they now are duly responsible to advocate for themselves continually to get interpreting services. So a lot of times an advocate can see the situation and say, you know what, maybe it's a good idea to get a deaf person that's also an interpreter, a CDI, and somebody that can really get the language that best suits that individual's needs. And that's called a CDI, a certified deaf interpreter, that works hand in hand with a hearing sign language interpreter. Also, deaf advocates help a deaf survivor feel that they're not alone in the world. It's very isolating as a survivor to feel like there's so much gossip going around, you're alone, you don't know how to navigate the system. And as an advocate, we want to, you know, ensure that they feel supported. We're also cultural moderators between the deaf and the hearing worlds to make sure that everything is working out fluid and working together.
And like Martha said, I think that it's really important to emphasize advocates involved in the process. When we are making the arrangements for interpreting services, I have talked with some ADA coordinators that have asked me and preferred me to directly request the interpreting services. That's fine. I'm okay with that. But also I think about, what if there's some deaf survivors out there that don't have the access to an advocate to make sure that that interpreting request is guaranteed. So that's something that's important to think about and keep in mind.
Yeah, and I did forget to mention something a little bit. There were, like, for an interpreting situation, for an example, there's some trust issues sometimes. Sometimes the survivor has been through abuse. Sometimes they go to court and they're sitting in court And a lot of times the interpreters may already know the judge, they already know the police that are involved because they're there and they've already established that rapport. So while the deaf person's sitting there waiting, they're watching the interpreters chatting and laughing with the, the judge and the officers. And now the deaf person feels even more isolated and feeling like they can't trust somebody and that they're not part of something, and they might withdraw or feel excluded. For one example, I went to a court situation one time and I noticed that the interpreter was over there and there was one interpreter over there on the other side of the room. And there were two interpreters who were laughing, they were flirting with each other across the room. And I thought, that's weird. I was a little bit confused about what was going on. Come to find out, the two interpreters were married. They were married to each other. And that's fine if you work together. But as a survivor in that situation, I felt even more like shy and withdrawn because there's somebody with their husband. I could see, them flirting with each other. It's a little bit, tricky. It's a little sticky in that situation. So, there's some situations that could come out of that. So, but did just want to clarify that really quick point about interpreting before we moved on.
Thank you, Martha. I wanted to kind of shift gears here and talk a little bit more about certified deaf interpreters. I'm not sure how many of you all out there use certified deaf interpreters in your courthouse. I highly recommend the use of a CDI because it's pretty fascinating and really effective. Now, those of you that are not that have never heard of a certified deaf interpreter and how that works in the interpreting process, let me explain. A certified deaf interpreter works in tandem with a hearing interpreter. Say I'm a deaf person and I'm giving my testimony. The CDI will sit in front of me, facing me. The hearing interpreter stands behind the deaf survivor or the deaf witness. The reason is because it's less distracting. If two people are signing within my line of sight, it's too much. So I just want to be able to see the CDI in front of me. And like I mentioned, CDIs have the language, they have the cultural nuances. And so I can just sign in my natural language and that CDI will be able to understand me. If I don't know ASL, that CDI will be able to match my language capabilities. They'll be able to do gestures, they can draw pictures, they role play, they can act out what's going on to make sure that they get the accuracy of the message that's being conveyed. Certified deaf interpreters are also considered cultural mediators. They're able to navigate both worlds. Let me talk a little bit about court language. Many deaf people in our community do not know the meanings for different legal terms. For example, a restraining order trial. Typically, that means that any type of contact with a particular person is not allowed. A hearing interpreter will interpret that a little bit more verbatim. They would sign all different types of contact are not allowed, and that's it. Now, a deaf person might think, okay, the sign contact means physical contact. It means touch. That's what the sign literally means in its translation. So that interpreter was not able to really conceptually show what that concept of contact was. So a CDI would say contact is not allowed. So no Facebook, no email contact, no asking your friends to contact that person for you. Don't wave at them, don't see them out in public. So that CDI will give the larger context of what contact means in regards to a legal restraining order. Also, CDIs are very skilled at catching those nuances in facial expressions, the unspoken message that shows in someone's body language. Deaf people communicate with their whole body, and so it's important for somebody to catch all of those little details that are being conveyed. Say, for example, a judge asked a deaf survivor, "Are you guilty?" A CDI would translate and say, "Are you guilty?" Now listen, guilty means that you are in trouble, that you are swearing that you did that and that you committed this crime. It's not a name sign of somebody, which the signs sometimes can be name signs for other people. So CDIs have to explain what the admission of guilt means. There have been deaf survivors that have thought that they were being called by their name sign or somebody that they knew because the sign for guilty is the same as somebody's name sign.
Also, a lot of people think that, just one interpreter is fine. Just have everybody use the one interpreter and you're all set. However, when there's two parties, which means we need two interpreters, the reason being is because one party might have a really proficient ASL interpreter on their end of the room, and maybe the other side of the room is a little bit more English, not quite as full ASL, and we don't want one interpreter for both parties, because you need an interpreter that's suited for each side of the room and each party represented accurately. A lot of deaf people may have other maybe things that may cause the interpretation to need to be clarified even more, such as they may require close vision, they may have some other vision problems, they may have a witness that's involved that's deaf, and sometimes if that's the case, we need 3 interpreters. So that way we have an interpreter that doesn't have their back to the parties that are in the room, and then one facing the witness. We don't want the interpreter have their back to the people that are watching the witness. And not to mention, these proceedings can take all day long, and the interpreter's brain, as it's constantly going and processing this information, might get a little worn out. And the usual turn taking time for interpreters to make sure their brain is nice and fresh is about 20 minutes. 20 minutes on, and then they'll switch with an interpreter, and they'll do 20 minutes off and support the other interpreter. So it is a little bit longer of a proceeding with interpreters in the room. So because it is a longer day, we need to have more interpreters than just one.
I'd like to add, in my experience, when survivors come in to look into getting a restraining order, often the other party is also deaf, and we know that the other party is not requesting, they may be faking it. And so sometimes we can see that statistic sometimes, so the court proceedings take a lot longer. So we can often tell the court that, hey, both parties have a deaf person, so you're going to need to reserve 2 interpreters for each party. Sometimes the party needs to reserve their own interpreting services by themselves.
Okay, the other thing, I know that a lot of courts do have a form called MC-410, and it looks like this on the screen, holding it up. And it's a request for accommodations for people with disabilities, which seems pretty simple, right? But not so much. In my experience, the court doesn't tend to use this form the same way that it might seem. It's a very, difficult navigation to find the right form, the right numbers, the right person to contact to get these accommodations. Maybe you're on hold for a long time. Maybe you're being transferred 3 to 5 times until you finally get through to the person that is responsible for requesting an interpreter. And then the person that they get a hold of says, no, you don't need an interpreter. It's like, no, now wait a minute. It's for me. I need the interpreter. So a lot of times, it's very rare that we hear back from these people. If we do happen to leave a message or try and get in contact, it's about 50-50 chance that you're going to get an interpreter. A lot of times it's really 50-50 that you're not going to have one. So sometimes the officers will be talking amongst themselves and they say, you know what, there's no interpreter. We're going to have to postpone. There's no interpreter, unfortunately. Now the survivor is even more stressed. They're waiting even longer. They can't get on with their life. They haven't told their side of the story. So I'm really encouraging that, there needs to be some kind of program or online form, or it's a very simple request to accommodation request form to get an interpreter. That way we can get a confirmation that an interpreter has been booked before they go, because the scheduled person who is responsible can answer in advance, and then they know with plenty of time, and the deaf survivor is not, overly stressed. It doesn't continue to affect their life because the proceedings keep going and going. So it's just a suggestion.
I want to add to that. So I see times where there are deaf survivors that feel conflicted. So if they have their own deaf rights, but at the same time, their needs of needing to have a trial and the proceedings go on quicker, it's conflicted. Sometimes it takes 2 hours to wait for a court interpreter to arrive. And so sometimes we'll have to tell the court, we only have 1 interpreter, but we need 2 for the 2 parties. And so sometimes lawyers will encourage a survivor to reschedule the trial, but they are often just wanting to get it over with because they're paying for that lawyer's time and they don't want to continue paying for it with a postponed trial. So if you look at all of the little details and the cost, it adds up. And so it's really important to think about prioritizing deaf survivors. Have them go first. Make sure the interpreters arrive on time so they can get out of there.
One thing I wanted to add is that it's really important to have deaf advocates because, for example, one time I went to a court and both parties were deaf. So I showed up and I realized that there was no interpreter. And I thought, that's interesting. Okay. The abuser had hired a lawyer already, and that lawyer was using their voice and speaking to the police and the bailiff and said, I want to continue. I don't want to postpone this. I want to get this over with. I want to do it now. And I had to step in and say, now, we need to wait for an interpreter. And I said, no, well, we need to wait. And they said, well, I don't know about that. So-and-so knows a little bit of sign in this courtroom. And the bailiff in question. I was shocked. The bailiff knew very little sign language. I said, no, we need a fluent, qualified interpreter. The bailiff using their minimal gestures and sign language is not going to cut it. And the lawyer looked at me and said, oh, well, you can read lips. They said that to me as the advocate. I said, I can read lips a little bit, but I'm a deaf person. I am not an interpreter. And the lawyer was overly flustered and very visually frustrated with me. And I'm okay with that. I'm the advocate. I'm used to people being frustrated with me, but that's why it's so critical that we have an advocate there, because it's important to have interpreters there. Deaf people sometimes don't know their rights. They're afraid, they're overwhelmed, they're sitting back, and other people are taking over. And we don't want that to happen. We want to provide them equal access, equal communication, first and foremost. Also, when it comes to accommodations, I did want to add something. A lot of people say, well, we have TTYs, which is that old teletypewriter device, which is very old-fashioned technology. It looks like an old-fashioned typewriter, but guess what? Deaf people don't use TTYs anymore. That's out the door. That's too old. Now people are using video phones. And that video phone is kind of like what we're using right now, where somebody's using sign language in a webcam, and the other person is seeing them on their side of the screen. However, if there's an interpreter that's in between those two parties, a lot of times it's not a certified deaf interpreter and it's going through a regular general interpreter. So when we're talking about survivors or people that have a different language that's not just formal ASL, a lot of times it is a challenge, and you have to be mindful that if you're using a video remote interpreter, a lot of times it's not one size fits all, like we said, and it's better to have an in-person interpreter. So for example, we had a deaf survivor. Let's say they're in a domestic violence situation and they're overwhelmed, and they thought the police were doing a good job by providing video remote interpreters. So an interpreter on a little screen that they bring into the room. They say, hey, we have the interpreter on our little computer or our iPad that we set up, and they're using sign language for the cops. And you might think, hey, that's no problem, right? We have an interpreter right there on our little screen. That's an accommodation, right? Well, not always. The deaf person is a survivor who happens to have limited visual skills as well. So it turns out they can't see this interpreter on this little tiny screen. They don't have the same communication access as an in-person interpreter. So the officer might say, there was nothing wrong. We provided that. But we're able to go in and explain that, no, this is a low vision client. This is not low vision friendly. You guys need to know the person that you're working with before providing just any interpreter service. But I know we're running out of time. We have to close pretty soon, but we really appreciate all of you guys serving the deaf community. It really does mean a lot to us. And really, we're more than happy to help in any way that we possibly can. So please do reach out to me. Again, my name is Martha from DeafSafe, or you could always contact Aracelia, and we'll be able to give you our contact information. Email us, reach out at any time. We're more than willing to help. Also, please go ahead and use any local resources that you have available to you. Call around and see if there's any deaf members in your community that might have a good idea, and ask them, hey, are there any preferred interpreting agencies? Because not all interpreting agencies are created equal. So the deaf members in the community tend to know who the good agencies are. Also, let's see, what else? What else did you want? Maybe any more questions? Go ahead and contact us. Don't be shy.
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate that this is a learning process. If you are frustrated or running into some roadblocks or need some more information, please contact us. We serve a lot of deaf survivors all around the country. So we look forward to talking to you if you need any more information. Again, thank you for coming. If you have any questions, if you need us to clarify anything, Rachel can jump in here and moderate.
Yes, I can help with any other questions. Yes, this is me, Rachel here. Just if there's any, final questions here at the last few minutes. There's a few I've noticed in the chat box, and there's some really great questions in there. There was one question that said, remember we were talking before about the example with the person who uses the sign for guilty, which looks maybe like a sign name for a deaf person with the G on the chest. Remember we talked about that, where the deaf person might misconstrue guilty for, oh, my friend that starts with the letter G. So a lot of the times the interpreter have to interrupt that process and tell the judge, hey, oh, sorry, excuse the interpreter. So the question is, should the interpreter be the one to interrupt, or should they just keep going?
Well, I think sometimes interpreters won't even pick up on that cue, and they won't realize that something is awry in the interpretation, and they won't even think to interrupt the judge. But I think it's important that as deaf people, we see a lot of those misunderstandings happening with interpreters, and the advocates see that too. They'll say, oh, the deaf person doesn't mean that, because we're able to see those, that we have that language proficiency.
One thing I wanted to add, that when you're talking with deaf survivors, a lot of them have gone through some serious trauma and they have triggers. And a lot of the times they don't want, for example, a male interpreter or maybe a female interpreter. So they're more willing to open up sometimes if they have an interpreter that matches their preference. That's a great comment. Yes, that's great. I think there was another question here. Are there great opportunities? Oh, grant, excuse the interpreter, grant opportunities to provide resources like video phones?
Well, just to let you know, video phones are free.
Yes, a deaf person, in order to get a video phone, they can apply, and it is free for a deaf person to get a video phone. They will request a video phone through a business who will provide it for free, and that's negotiated through the video phone provider. But we do encourage deaf people to have a video phone because it's a great self-advocacy tool.
Good for shelters.
And it's good for shelters to have a video phone too, so that when deaf people go to these shelters, they have the same access that other people do. And as far as other funding opportunities, you can file with OVW, the Office of Violence Against Women. I believe I said that right. Yes, the Office of Violence Against Women, OVW. They have a lot of great financial opportunities for deaf and hard of hearing people, or other culturally linguistic specific programs like CLPs or ISPs. Other grants that are up there for people with disabilities in general. So you can always apply for maybe a victim of crime act. So the Victim of Crime Act also offers their own pool of money and some funding through them. So there's a couple different ways to take advantage of those opportunities. Let me see here. There's another question that says, as deaf advocates, we do have experience where either a judge or an officer doesn't see it as quite a serious situation because they have never dealt with a deaf advocate before. And they feel like, this really isn't that big of a deal. Martha says, yes, we experience that all the time. They might think, oh, the interpreter's there, they're an advocate. Nope, that is not true. The interpreter is there solely as an interpreter in that role. So they can't provide an advocacy role. They can't provide the steps. They can't show, do the role play and explain and break down things before. So that's a huge emphasis that is confusing. Maybe CPS thinks, oh, they have an interpreter there, so they're an advocate, which is not true. We do need an advocate there on top of that. So a lot of times that is not thought of. And I say, yes, I am more willing to help. We need to be respectful to that person's needs. And it really depends on where you are in the area. Sometimes in bigger cities like here, I am noticing that the judges are more used to having us in the room, but sometimes in other areas, not so much.
Yeah, and I can relate, particularly for law enforcement. They're not quite used to the whole proceeding when it comes with interpreters. But I have a worker's ID from the Alameda Family Justice Center. So I have a benefit there, and that helps kind of give validity about my role in the courtroom.
That's right, and that's very important, that as advocates or any other person who is providing services to deaf people, to make sure they have a rapport with law enforcement, with the clerk, with the judge, because if they're going to be going in on an ongoing basis, they need to have that established rapport so that they are more accepted, and the court staff are more used to that situation, because it's really important that the deaf person, let's say, for example, they are filling out a police report and then they're overwhelmed with all this information. The officer just needs some detailed, extensive information. What we can do as advocates is we can go in and say, hey, they need to know what happened. They need to know the date. They need to know the time. And then they can help relay that to the law enforcement. And they can help get that information clarified. And that helps in court too. Oftentimes they'll ask a yes or no question in court. That's when, let's say, for example, did he call you? Seems simple enough, right?
Mhm.
The interpreter might say, okay, did they call you? And they'll be like, oh, well, we were in a fight, and then I walked out, and then I got in the car, and then they'll go on this long tangent, and then they called me. But all the leading information up to that, the judge isn't interested in. They're saying, no, it's a yes or no question. That's all. So there's a little bit of a cultural mediation that needs to happen, and a misunderstanding to get a precise and concise answer. So that's the job of the advocate to say, no, they're just saying yes or no, kind of a thing. So maybe a deaf advocate can.
Where do we get a deaf advocate?
So somebody's asking, where do they get a deaf advocate?
Yeah, there's a website called www.deafta.org. Rachel will type it out for all of you. It's DEAF, T as in Tom, A.org. And this is a great website. It's a deaf resource center, but it's really helpful because it has all of the sister agencies listed across the country. And so that's an easy one-stop shop for you to go and find the types of resources that you need.
Also, there is a hotline, a 24/7 hotline for deaf advocates. So if survivors do need to talk to a deaf advocate and there aren't any in their local area that they might be able to reach out to, there is a hotline, and it's located in Washington State. So there's a hotline. I'll be able to post that information there as well. But they can talk with an advocate. And oftentimes, Aracelia or Martha or myself, even personally, we have talked with survivors that are out of our area. So a lot of times the survivors are in another state. They don't know what the resources are, or there aren't any available, and we're able to explain the process and kind of advocate for them and talk about how they need to get a video phone or texting or email set up, because we strongly believe that survivors should have equal access and have, the same rights and should have the same accessibility as everybody else. So, they need the most information that would be helpful to them when it comes to getting an interpreter, which, may solve the problem, is just having an interpreter. And sometimes the courthouse or the judge or the law enforcement may think that, we're fine with that one. And part of our job is to educate them as well. There was also a question about the national directory of that. Okay, we got that answered. So who makes the request for the deaf advocate? And how can we ask for a deaf advocate? Well, I would suggest see in your local area what your resources are. There may be an adjacent state or adjacent town or city that you may have to reach out to, because oftentimes an advocate works for a specific organization as a community advocate, and they have one that's, whose role is to provide advocacy in that area, but not for other areas. So there are people that are great resources to know, people in other outlying areas or people that are closer to you that can help get you in contact with the right person and advocate for you in your area. So sometimes they can help spread the word. That's just one great example. Also, Martha's saying, I did want to make the point that not all deaf people want a deaf advocate. We can't force advocacy on deaf people. We don't want deaf people to feel like we're getting in their business. Sometimes they feel like that's the case. Sometimes they've been traumatized from somebody in their culture and they don't want a deaf advocate, and that's okay. So somebody asked about if there's courtroom captioning available in Los Angeles.
I've worked in the court system probably 5 years, and I have not seen captioning in a courtroom yet, no.
However, in my experience, the interpreter actually does a little bit better of a job, because when it comes to language, a lot of it's on the face, a lot of it's on the body, and having an interpreter in person is a lot better. Sometimes the deaf person sees these English words coming across their screen, and they're like, it's not really hitting home as much, and they're not able to fully grasp the message. because ASL, American Sign Language, is not English on the hands. It is not word for word English.
And signed English is another type of language modality. It's called signing exact English, or SEE, C sign. Some deaf people use that, and that's a totally different sign system than ASL.
The other questions, we have a couple minutes left. Yes. So the question is, what if we don't want to ask for a CDI, but we just want more information to see if there's one in the community? How do we find out if there's any CDIs?
There's two options. You can check the RID website. That'll give a list of different CDIs in your area via your zip code. Or you can ask your local courthouse. The ADA coordinator should have that information. Ask them what types of names are on their CDI list, and that will get you what you need.
Because remember, certified does not necessarily mean they're fully qualified or skilled. So a deaf interpreter may be the best match. An interpreter that can hear, that's qualified and certified, might not be enough.
There are not a lot of CDIs across this country. We have a shortage. And so now with the courtroom trying to meet the needs of the demand for having CDIs in courts, we're starting to have a certified deaf interpreter work with a up-and-coming deaf interpreter that doesn't have their certification yet. When we have a hearing with 2 to 4 deaf participants, we need more than one CDI.
It looks like there was a great question here that asked about if there's deaf survivors who don't have a formal language and maybe just use lip reading and don't use ASL. That's great. I have one example that just happened with me just recently, about 2 weeks ago. So we had a class here at our agency, and it was about basics of learning written English. And so there was somebody who was foreign born and moved here to America. They were taking this class to learn basic English skills. So they were learning about just basic communication, basic English. And this person in particular was a little bit older. I would want to say maybe like 45 or 50 years old or so. But they had almost no language whatsoever. They were very gestural. They only were able to just barely gesture to communicate, such as eat. And for that sign, they would just use the gesture of putting food in their mouth. So something very basic. So I've come across that. And there's maybe times where they only know a few signs. So we call that home signs, where a deaf person developed their own unique code of gestures that they used at home, maybe with their family growing up. That is not a formal language, and they may have no language. So for example, what happened is they came to us and we saw that there was really a huge bruise on their arm. And we saw that big bruise and I thought, what's going on? I wonder what happened. So I asked them about it and they were like, oh, and they were just kind of gesturing and pointed to somebody and said, they beat me. And I went, oh, so obviously somebody was hitting them. So they were gesturing. I could tell by that. So I pointed and I said, I was asking, who is that? And I couldn't really get it out of them. They couldn't articulate the name of the person who it was. So I was trying to get it out of them. Like, was it a man or a woman? But they couldn't even answer. They didn't know the sign for man. They didn't know the sign for woman. So I was trying to figure out and really struggled to get this information, but I couldn't figure out who it was that they meant was hitting them. About a week later, I want to say, a teacher was walking outside with that particular client, that student. So they were walking outside and they pointed to that person and said, there, in that car. And it just so happened to be your sister who was sitting in the car. Her sister came to our agency for a separate, reason. She came separately and she was pointing. She's like, there, that person right there. They were pointing. And then we knew it was her sister who happened to come to our office for something separate, who she happened to see in the parking lot. So that happened to be, that can be problematic because sometimes the officer will ask these very extensive questions about who and what and where and why. And a lot of times it requires the help of an interpreter who can hear, a deaf interpreter, somebody that's also deaf, to try and get what we can, because sometimes there is very limited in language. They may not know the date and time. We may not be able to figure out if it was last week, if it was 2 weeks ago. And oftentimes the court doesn't have time. They're saying, no, we're not going to hold up for this. We don't have time to get all this clarifying information. This is taking too long. And the court says, no, they can't comment. We just don't have time to get their information down. So that can be a struggle. But written, as far as like written language, and that wouldn't really help because sometimes they may not have a formal language. So drawing pictures, that's a great one. That can take hours and hours and hours and a lot of time invested to get the full picture. And then things can be taken to the police and taken to the court. So it can be a challenge, just to be honest. Also, another question, where can I get a video phone? So online, I'm going to type the website. So it's www.sorenson, Sorenson, Sorenson.com, or purple.com, like the color. That's another website. But any other questions before we close up here? Any other final questions? Okay, it talks about maybe they haven't, the client hasn't had domestic violence, but maybe they've been molested or had other traumatic experience in their life, or maybe they have other health issues or behavioral issues. We are not certified to provide services. Wait, hold on one moment. Oh, like in a rape center. Okay, yes, sometimes counseling services here is, not the whole picture. We need more. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and respond to these questions in the thread as we close here, but do continue to reach out. I'm going to respond to all of these questions, but thank you everybody for joining. I will talk about certified deaf interpreters. CDI is certified deaf interpreter. DI means deaf interpreter who is not certified. Okay. Martha says, also, if there's any follow-up questions, we'd be more than happy to help. So stay in contact with us.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Appreciate that very much. Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you. Bye.